think I was just thinking that this is the first shot of the city at night that I've ever done of this series. And there's more to these to come, but I feel like I just need to develop the city a bit more. And in this episode, in our pursuit of development and expansion and all those things that you're kind of craving to see, I'm sure, we're going to be working on the Old Town, at least partially. And what I mean by that is that we may not necessarily finish this by the end of this episode, though we're going to get a pretty good idea on how big this area of the city is going to be and how it's going to look like. So stay tuned for that. But first, I decided to go back to one of the early areas of the city, and I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but I keep saying that this is an ever-evolving project. So nothing that you see on the screen is ever really finished, and this is proof of that because I'm putting down some stairs. Given this super tall height retaining wall that we have here, I decided to sort of combine these props to create different steps that will potentially allow people to go from the top part, especially near the station. If we didn't have a shortcut here, people would have to just walk a long way just around this cliff. I decided to sort of create this shortcut here. It is still a little bit steep, but this is somewhat related to what I was mentioning in the first episode of the series, if I remember correctly, where the scale of the mountains is really hard to gauge until you put a building next to it. A road wouldn't do it, trees wouldn't do it. You just need to put buildings so you can actually see the height of the people around it, and that kind of gives you an idea on how tall things are. At least that's how it works for me. But this was a great excuse to sort of remove a couple ugly buildings that I clipped. I mean, the buildings were great, but the way I clipped them against that wall wasn't necessarily the best. So just went for this design. In fact, this is going to be a functional design. In a second, you're going to see me put down a pedestrian path, kind of clipping through it. Obviously, it's going to look a little bit glitchy. In fact, there's going to be some of the fences are going to sort of creep from the edges of things. I'm going to do my best to sort of hide that. And obviously, as people, walk up and down, there's going to be some, you're just going to see the head at parts. And then at other parts, you're just going to see the whole body. It's just going to look a little bit weird. This make way more sense in the cinematics at the end, which brings me to something that I wanted to prepare you for. In the previous video, there's a viewer who suggested I do sort of before and after kind of shot. So there's going to be some like the first clip of the cinematics sequence. It's just going to be this awesome pan shot of the entire city where it kind of fades in with the things that we built throughout this episode. So I'm really excited to show you that. I think it came out great, and I've done that before. I remember doing that at the very end of Cedar Valley. Just sort of compare or show you the evolution of the different episodes. I might do that again for this one later on as we accomplish more things. Maybe open up like a really old save, let's say episode 2 or 3, or even this one for that matter. And while by the time we're on episode 20 or whatever, I'm not saying we're going to do 20 episodes, or I'm also not saying we're only going to do 20 episodes. Makes any sense? I keep going on all these weird tangents. I do apologize for that, but at this point, all I'm doing here is just adding a few more details just to keep this area a little bit more interesting. I try to sort of pay closer attention to the detail work in the different scenes that I like to point the camera towards. I sort of tweeted a photo of this or a screenshot of this a few days ago, so hopefully you catch that. And if you're not following me on Twitter, that I tend to post channel updates and screenshots and teasers and things, so that might be a good reason for you to do so. And just sort of moving away from that for a little bit, I think I may come back and just adjust a few more things. I don't know if you actually caught that on camera, but I decided to sort of start working on this old town, which will be sitting between the waterfront, or this double tram track that I have here, and the city, or the part of the city that we already built. And it's gonna feature a lot of really narrow roads, and in this case these roads are pretty thick, but the idea here is that I'm actually going to be clipping the buildings onto the sidewalk, or at least over the sidewalk, if that makes any sense. And the blocks are going to be like much smaller than the ones we did. So again, in the cinematics there's some like aerial shots that sort of show you how how big this section of the city is compared to the one we already built. So that's sort of the idea here. And I also wanted to sort of take advantage of the terrain that we had here. A lot of comments were basically giving me praise for actually keeping or staying with the terrain difficulty that we set up to, as a sort of challenge. And, like they were glad that I just didn't flatten everything out to put the city. I did flatten a lot of things out. And for the most part, the building's doing a lot of work, flattening things out. But it is kind of an interesting design when you pan the camera from the shoreline all the way to the train station. You can see the progression like slowly creeping up in height. I think that was certainly a look that I was after. So I'm glad that you enjoy that as much as I do. And this part right here is no exception. I have like two hills sort of that are set at different heights. And I really wanted to do something unique with that, or at least take advantage of this terrain feature as much as possible. Since this is an area that's going to be visible pretty much throughout the city, even when you're looking at the city from the water, I wanted to have some like big footprint buildings be placed at different levels on these two tiny hills that were here. So in just a couple of minutes, you're going to see me put down a church, a museum, and some sort of government house that's primarily what's going to take shape in this old town. The area that I left for the old town, as you can see, there's like very compressed network of roads. It's actually going to extend a little bit beyond that, except that this episode we're just going to be building partially one of the areas. And what I'm doing here right now is trying to make a square out of this crazy grid that I came up with, because I want to have some sort of a central square that, unfortunately, given the time that I had, is going to be vacant until probably the next episode, when I just do one more pass at detailing things. Even though I'm going to add a lot of detail in this episode, just coming up in a few seconds, I do want to keep adding a lot more. In fact, this is the episode where I added the most props so far. I think by the end of the episode, we're going to be sitting at 300-ish props, which is nothing compared to projects that I've done before. Just so you know, if you're new to City Skylines, the maximum amount of props without any mods that you can add is 65,000. And the mods that allow you to go beyond that are kind of finicky, so I try to stay away from those, try to optimize my prop usage as much as possible, so just something to keep in mind. And honestly, in this episode, I was, for some reason, like really, really pumped. I pretty much recorded this in a day. I had nothing planned because last week I spent basically the whole week preparing the live stream that we just did last weekend. Together with Flux and B-Schoolhausen, we did the live stream finale for FBS, which was an absolute success. And if you missed it, there's a 10-hour recorded live stream that you can watch. I don't know if I'd recommend that, but it was certainly a ton of fun, and hopefully we can do that again. Now, before I go totally off topic, what you're about to see is something that was inspired by one of my recent trips to France. In northern France, there's a city called Dinard that's right across the bay from Saint-Malo, which is a pretty popular destination. You've probably heard of it, or at least seen pictures of it. But what I wanted to do is sort of bridge this gap between the two hills. And I realized that if I put keys all around and just kept raising up in terms of terrain, it was going to divide the city quite dramatically. So I instead went for this bridge approach, which I actually got some footage of the bridge that I actually based this on a little bit. It's not a copy or anything like that, but I thought it was really interesting. And you're going to see by the end, or at least as I finish detailing this bridge, it's going to look great. In fact, it's probably going to look nicer than the one in real life. I'm kidding. But it's certainly a bit more detailed, less industrial, I guess is what I was aiming for. Actually took some ideas from B-Schoolhausen, who said that there's a lot of people using his Bay Bridge parts to decorate other things. So to make it a little bit more interesting, I decided to embellish the pillars for this bridge with some of the parts from the Bay Bridge. And you're going to see that in just a second. At the same time, I also wanted the keys to not be totally straight all the time, even though it's much easier to do it that way. I decided to add some curves. I was looking at sort of the walls, all these rocky walls that keep Dinard in place, or at least part of the city in place. and not everything is straight line, so I decided to add some curves every once in a while to keep things a bit more interesting. And again, going with this technique of having segments that don't connect with one another. That way we can achieve some sort of staggered or tiered levels. I think that's a nice looking technique. And again, we're gonna go crazy with these stairs prop. They're really, really versatile, and they blend in perfectly with the keys themselves. So that was certainly a breeze to deal with. In terms of all the glitchiness that's taking place with the terrain and everything, that was certainly a challenge. The camera was just bouncing all over the place. That's when you try to add a lot of detail with networks, it really gets a little bit more challenging, but it's certainly doable. In this case, however, I decided not to put pedestrian connections to all these things. They're just for looks. No one is actually going to be walking on those stairs. I know there's like techniques. I've seen people do like crazy things in City Skylines where people actually use stairs like this. I maybe look into it because obviously these are not the only stairs of these types that we're going to have in the city. So it might be interesting to see if there's an easy way to get people, up and down stairs in a realistic sort of way. Now, here comes the fun part, putting down a lot of buildings. And as you can see, I'm sort of clipping them in a way so that they are sitting on the sidewalk, on the lighter part of this cobblestone road. And, that is, since I don't have any roads that are narrower than this, or at least, I do have some roads that are narrower than this, but they don't look as good as this one. This one looks pretty clean, and I decided to stay with that. Just try to keep these buildings just very close to the actual road segment of the texture, or at least the part of this network that has the road texture in it. Pretty much mixing up all kinds of commercial and residential and office areas. That's primarily what I've been just putting down in the city. Did I just say zoning? Yeah, no, I'm not zoning. I'm like straight up plopping things based on the different zoning types, I guess is what I was trying to say. But as you can see, the RCI demands for residential, so I try to focus more on that than anything else. We do have the realistic population mod, which I don't know if it's helping or not, or making things worse, but I kind of like it, so it's there. In fact, I think it was like mentioned a couple times in the comments. At some point it started raining. I don't know if I accidentally disabled that feature, but here's what Nighta looks under the rain. There's some weird bump there on the main square. I need to actually go back and fix that. It's not just a terraforming thing. I think it's the building this big government palace thing, which happens to be vanilla, I think, if I'm not mistaken. There's some really good buildings that are vanilla, especially for the European theme, more so than the generic theme, if I might say. But that one looked great. I obviously had to, take away all the, just remove all the props, basically, because those weren't great. Or they do look great, but the position is like totally all over the place. So just remove those and call it a day. Basically, is what you see is how it's going to end up, except for that hole in the ground, which is I'm sure it's caused by the building. I need to figure that out. Now here, it's an interesting change of pace. I've decided to add this sort of extended platform here that will lead into this bigger building that I'm about to put in just a second. It's a museum. But also worth noting is the fact that I just broke that wall and just replaced the tiny segment with fence. So it looks like there's an actual gate there, even though it's just a different type of wall. It's a nice detail that I thought looked great, and I'm probably going to be using that all over the city in the future or in the upcoming builds. Obviously spending some time adding some vegetation, trees of all kind. I think I added a lot of new trees to the collection as well. So if you're following the series, if you're following the series and you want to just, or you're trying to replicate everything I do, or at least inspired by it, maybe get the new trees, because they're actually pretty awesome. They're mostly Padelmo trees. I usually have them on all my collections. For some reason, I didn't have it on this one yet, but I do now. So there's that. I also have this, by the way, this is the museum that I was telling you about a second ago. Just decided to fence it out, have some nice entrance, again, with the gated sort of thing. In this case, it was a little bit harder because I already had a black fence. It's less of a contrast compared to the wall across the street that you see over there. And then just finally putting down some pedestrian paths that sort of connect the different areas of this tiered section of the city. Probably the road that goes underneath the that overpass that I just did is going to have tram tracks, and I've been sort of expanding or upgrading every couple of roads or every couple of blocks to sort of prepare for mass transit expansions in the near future. But this is pretty much the before and after everything that we did during this episode. And if you enjoyed it, please consider giving this video a like. As usual, that's free. There's no charge for that. And if you're new to the channel and haven't already, subscription button as well as notification bell will be below. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.